All right, everyone. It's noon on May 25th, 2022, and I'd like to welcome you to the MeCHAP Veterinary Continuing Ed webinar. And for those of you who don't know, MeCHAP stands for Maine Cattle Health Assurance Program. That won't win you any crossword puzzles, but at least you know what it means now. And I'm Carol Delaney. I'm the livestock specialist in the animal health program in the Maine Department of Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry. And this is the third in a series of webinars we've been giving for veterinarians. And I'll do a little bit of housekeeping, and then we'll try to dive right in. This will go from noon until 2 p.m. It's being recorded now, and we will post the recording as well as a PDF of the presentation on our website later for you to refer to. We're going to have a break about halfway through, and I'd ask you to, you definitely can and ask questions on the topic being presented at the time, either by the route of the chat, or you can unmute yourself and ask directly. And we just want you to keep on topic. And I would like to say that in the Department of the Animal Health Program, we also have Dr. Rachel Fisk, who's an assistant state veterinarian who's out in the field right now. Dr. Michelle Walsh, a state veterinarian, and also assistant state veterinarian, Dr. Carolyn Hurwitz, will be with us today. And as you can see in this slide, which is right on the homepage of the website, that the HPAI, highly pathogenic avian influenza, is still considered high risk at this time. And this will be emphasized again, but telling your clients to keep their birds away from wild waterfowl and how to report them. And at the bottom, just a reminder that if you work with cattle clients, then they can get free RFID official ID tags by contacting Donna Flint. Next slide, please. All right, so today's webinar, Handling HPAI, Understanding the Transmission, Disease Diagnostics, and How to Respond to this FAD. We are very delighted to have Dr. Megan Leidy back with us. She actually presented last year at this time, and I'll give a little background so you can get to know her better. But she has studied poultry and avian science since her days getting her bachelor's from Penn State in 2007. Then she went to the Virginia Maryland Regional College of Veterinary Medicine, and in 2013 received her DVM. Then, if that wasn't enough, she continued in Virginia Tech and received her PhD with an emphasis on poultry medicine. I believe it was in Clostridial dermatitis in turkeys in 2015. And I will say during those years, because I could see her CV, she has GPAs that would brew a strong cup of coffee, let's put it that way. And she also, in 2017, attained her board certification through the American College of Poultry Veterinarians. So if you see the last letters at the end of her name, it means diplomat of the American College of Poultry Veterinarians. Now, she did spend 4 years working as staff veterinarian for Jenny O Turkey Store, and where she provided veterinary services to company-owned and contract turkey farms throughout central Minnesota. So she has a really good clinical background too. But she returned to Pennsylvania at the beginning of the pandemic in January of 2020 as an associate clinical professor, working in the avian diagnostic and as the outreach veterinarian at Penn State Animal Diagnostic Lab. In her current role, she provides diagnostic pathology services for all avian species and extension education programs for the commercial poultry industry and small backyard poultry flock owners. So without further ado, please start your program.
Thank you for that introduction. Suppose I didn't need this slide. So today we're going to talk about avian influenza, and especially focusing on high path AI. But before we get into the specifics of what's going on right now, I wanted to give a brief overview on what is this disease in the background, just to make sure we're all on the same page. So avian influenza is caused by type A influenza viruses, and wild waterfowl and shorebirds are the natural reservoir host for avian influenza viruses. In these species, infections are generally asymptomatic. So there's no clinical signs of any kind. You would never know that these birds are infected unless you did testing to verify that. The virus is primarily shed in feces, but also other body secretions. And people, animals, our clothing, footwear, vehicles, tools, equipment, feed and water can all become contaminated with the virus and serve as vectors for disease spread to domestic flocks. There's a few different ways that we classify avian influenza viruses. So the first is based on pathogenicity, or the ability to make birds sick. So this is specifically defined based on the ability to produce severe lethal disease in chickens following experimental IV inoculation. So LPAI, or low pathogenicity avian influenza viruses, are viruses that may cause no or only mild clinical signs or mortality in domestic poultry. And these are the viruses that are typically much more common in the United States. HPAI, or highly pathogenic avian influenza, are viruses that can cause severe disease and significant mortality in chickens, but also other gallinaceous species, including turkeys, pheasants, peafowl. And so the difference between low path and high path comes down to changes in the amino acid sequence of the hemagglutinin protein. So the hemagglutinin protein is a surface glycoprotein that's responsible for the virus's ability to attach to host cells. So when the virus replicates, it initially produces an inactive precursor of that hemagglutinin protein. And then host cell proteases actually cleave that initial precursor of hemagglutinin into its final active form. And so with the low path viruses, the amino acid sequence at that cleavage site can only be acted upon by a limited number of cellular proteases. So that limits the number of cell types that that virus can infect and replicate in. So that's primarily restricted to the enteric or the respiratory tracts. However, with high path AI viruses, there's a mutation at that cleavage site that allows them to be cleaved by several ubiquitous cellular proteases, resulting in the virus's ability to infect a much wider variety of cell types in that host, resulting in systemic disease. So another way to classify avian influenza viruses is based on those surface proteins. So there's the hemagglutinin protein, of which there are 16 known H types of avian influenza viruses. And H5 and H7 viruses are the ones that we worry about the most because those have the potential to become highly pathogenic for domestic poultry. There's another surface protein known as neuraminidase, of which there are 9 known types. And so you can have different combinations of the H type and the N type, resulting in different subtypes. There's 144 possible combinations, and at least 130 of those have been identified in wild birds from around the world. Another way that we refer to avian influenza viruses is based on their what we call virus lineage. So that's based on the location of the strain origin. So basically, where did we first isolate that virus? So we talk about North American lineage viruses. So those are viruses that are native to North America and circulate in our wild bird populations here. And then we also commonly talk about Eurasian lineage viruses. So these are viruses that originated in Europe and or Asia. So because those H5 and H7 viruses have the potential to become highly pathogenic, all H5 and H7 viruses, whether low path or high path, are considered reportable in the US. So any suspect case must be reported immediately to either the state veterinarian or the APHIS area veterinarian in charge. And so even those low path viruses are reportable, and we do a response to those because we have seen cases where a low path virus gets into domestic poultry and then mutates, and then we see a subsequent high path outbreak. And that's actually happened 4 times in the US within the last 6 years, or 3 times within the last 6 years. Highly pathogenic avian influenza is considered a foreign animal disease in the US. And so detections in poultry are considered internationally reportable to the OIE. And so there's a lot of text on this slide, but I want to stress that there's a very specific definition for poultry when it comes to international reporting requirements. So poultry refers to birds kept in captivity for any commercial purposes, as well as fighting cocks and birds for restocking game. However, birds that are kept by a single household and the products of which are used exclusively within that same household are not considered poultry. So many backyard flocks do not meet the international definition for poultry. However, there are some backyard flocks that may meet that definition if there's someone who has, 100 chickens and they sell eggs at a roadside stand or a farmer's market, that would meet the international reporting requirement. So as many of you may remember, we had a previous very large outbreak of HPAI in the US. Started in 2014 with detections in wild birds in Washington and Oregon, and then continued through the spring and summer, and ended up with 211 commercial premises and 21 backyard or non-commercial premises affected across 15 states. And it resulted in the death or depopulation of over 50 million birds. There were actually two different viruses, an H5N2 and an H5N8, that were involved in that outbreak. And this was considered the worst animal disease outbreak in US history. There were $879 million of direct federal expenditures in response to that outbreak, with an estimated total economic impact of around $3 billion. And the last detection during that outbreak was June 15th. So our current situation is we're dealing with an outbreak of a Eurasian lineage H5N1 clade 2.3.4.4b virus, and I'll explain what that means in a minute. So the first reported detection in North America was at December 20th, and Canada, they reported a detection in a multi-species exhibition flock in Newfoundland and Labrador. Then in January, USDA reported detection in a wild duck in South Carolina. And on February 9th, the USDA reported detection in the first domestic flock. And that was a commercial turkey flock in Indiana. So getting back to that specific virus. So this is a Eurasian lineage H5, sometimes referred to as the goose Guangdong lineage HPAI virus. So this virus family was first identified in a domestic goose in the Guangdong province of China in 1996. And there have been, there's been an evolution of this virus. And so it's actually evolved over time into 10 distinct clades within multiple subclades. So clade 2.3.4 is this here. It's considered the fourth order class of this virus. So both the 2014 outbreak as well as the current outbreak are in clade 2.3.4.4. The current outbreak is B, and the 2014-2015 outbreak was C. So these are kind of considered cousins and closely related viruses. So a similar virus has been circulating widely throughout Europe, Asia, and Africa in recent years, and this virus has caused devastating losses for poultry owners and has also caused some significant wild bird mortality events. So this map shows the detections from October 1st of 2020 through September 30th of 2021, so the previous year's influenza cycle. And you can see that there's no detections in North America. So, this virus has been very widespread and causing significant losses. And what's unique about this virus is that it's circulating in wild birds in a highly pathogenic form. The vast majority of avian influenza viruses circulate in wild birds in a low path form. So you have low path viruses that are circulating in wild birds, that there's a spillover event, and that virus gets introduced into domestic flocks. A mutation then occurs to high path within those domestic flocks. You may see an outbreak that's maintained in domestic flocks for a little while, but detection and depopulation efforts basically eradicate that specific high path virus, and the outbreak ends. However, with this goose guangdong lineage virus, what happened is we had a spillover event into domestic poultry, and that outbreak was not contained. And we actually had a reverse spillover of that high path virus back into wild birds. And then that wild bird population started maintaining that high path form of the virus. And we've now had sustained transmission of that high path virus in wild bird populations since 1996, with repeated spillover events back into domestic poultry. It's also unusual in that we are seeing wild bird mortality associated with this virus. Most of our high path viruses do not cause mortality in wild birds. So how did this virus get to the United States? So this map shows the migratory flyways. And the virus started out in China. There's the Central Asian flyway that overlaps with both the East Asian and the East African flyway that led to spread into Africa, Middle East, and Europe. And then we have the East Atlantic flyway that connects Europe with the breeding grounds in northern Canada. And when you look at this view of the map, it looks like a pretty far distance for wild birds to travel from Europe to North America. But we do have to remember that the Mercator projection map is a really terrible representation of actual distance. So if you look at a circumpolar view of the world, and don't worry about the specific viruses on here, just trying to show how close that Europe and North America become, as well as Asia and North America, when you look at it from the top of the globe. So basically, we had wild birds that traveled from Europe over to the breeding grounds in northern Canada, and then we have the Atlantic flyway. And so basically, our initial detections of that virus were along the eastern coast of Canada and North America. So basically, the virus traveled with wild birds down the east coast. And then when we get down into South and Central America, all 4 North American flyways actually converge. So we see wild birds migrating down these flyways in the fall. They commingle in the Mexico and Central America in the winter. And then in the spring, they start migrating back up. So if something comes down one flyway in the US in the fall, it may find its way back up one of the other flyways in the spring. So this map shows all of the detections in North America through this May 17th. The green dots are wild bird detections. The yellow dots are backyard or non-commercial flocks. The red dots are commercial flocks. And there's some blue diamonds on there that are a little hard to see that we've actually had a few detections in wild mammals, primarily foxes, in Ontario, Michigan, Minnesota, and Wisconsin. And one thing I do want to point out on this map is, so most of our initial detections were right along the Atlantic flyway, right along the coast. And then we started to see it spread across the US. We did have a detection in a bald eagle in Vancouver, British Columbia, that genetic sequencing actually indicates was a completely separate introduction via the Pacific flyway. And so what remains to be seen is whether some of these detections on the western portion of the United States, if those are more similar to the Pacific flyway introduction, or if those are more similar to the Atlantic flyway introduction. So all of these domestic flock viruses are being sequenced, and in the coming months, we will have more information on that. So current status, as of May 17th, we've had 1,190 detections in wild birds across 37 states. As far as species affected, it's primarily waterfowl with various species of ducks and geese, also some shorebirds with various species of gulls, also some pelicans. And we have seen wild bird mortality in bald eagles, owls, hawks, falcons, and vultures. It is important to remember that our current wild bird surveillance efforts only sample a very small subset of the total migratory bird population. And so the fact that we're seeing this many detections is really concerning. As far as domestic poultry, and in this case, I'm referring to poultry in the sense of the way that we view poultry, so chickens and turkeys, and not referring to the OIE definition. So as of noon yesterday, USDA had confirmed 351 total domestic premises in 35 states. That includes 183 commercial premises and 168 backyard or non-commercial premises, resulting in the death or depopulation of approximately 38 million birds. As far as distribution across the country, right now, Minnesota has been the hardest hit in terms of total number of cases. They've had a significant number of commercial turkey flocks as well as some backyard flocks. South Dakota also had significant number of commercial turkey flocks. Idaho has been, I believe, all backyard flocks. And so the comparison here to the 2015 outbreak is we're seeing a much wider distribution across the United States. And we are also seeing a lot more backyard flock detections with the current outbreak than we saw in 2015. And we've also seen a lot more wild bird detections. That is probably a combination of increased surveillance efforts. Obviously, after the 2015 outbreak, we've increased the amount of surveillance that we're doing in wild birds. So naturally, if you do more testing, you will typically tend to find more infections. But it does seem that there's also an increased prevalence of this virus in wild bird populations. So far, genetic sequencing of viruses does suggest that we are seeing a lot of separate wild bird introductions into domestic flocks. However, there are some parts of the country where there is evidence for farm-to-farm spread once it gets into domestic poultry. As far as Maine goes, you've had 12 detections in backyard or non-commercial flocks. This picture shows kind of density of known poultry premises according to USDA APHIS records. So the darker the color of the county, the more birds there are in that county. So last detection in Maine, to my knowledge, was on April 5th. And I believe all of your surveillance areas have been released, but I believe Dr. Walsh might be addressing that after the break. So as far as clinical signs of highly pathogenic avian influenza, the big one in domestic flocks is a sudden increase in mortality. And you may see that sudden increase in mortality without any other clinical signs. If we do see other clinical signs, they can be highly variable because this virus can infect so many different cell types. So you'll see decreased energy and appetite, decreased egg production, soft-shelled, thin-shelled, or misshapen eggs. You may see swelling or purple discoloration of the head, eyelids, or legs. You may see respiratory signs, including difficulty breathing, coughing, sneezing, nasal discharge. You may see neurologic signs, including incoordination or stumbling, twisting of the head and neck, so torticollis, or diarrhea. Now, many of those signs by themselves are not specific, so it is important to take the whole clinical history as well as the mortality into mind when you're trying to decide if this sounds like high path or not. So here's just a couple of pictures. So here you can see dark discoloration of the comb and the wattles. This bird's pretty depressed. There's some swelling of the face. While this is consistent with high path AI, it is not specific for high path AI. There are other respiratory diseases that can create a very similar clinical picture. Here you can see that red to purplish discoloration on the legs and feet. There's pretty much two things that do this: high path AI and virulent Newcastle disease. So if you're seeing this in a backyard flock, this is an immediately call your state veterinarian. If you see this, talk to the producer, find some more information. Definitely a good idea to get some samples collected. But if you're seeing this red to purple discoloration on the legs, this is something that you should be very concerned about. It is important to note that waterfowl, so ducks and geese, are still going to be primarily asymptomatic with these high path AI viruses. With some of the commercial duck breeder flocks, they have reported a slight decrease in egg production with the current outbreak. But commercial meat ducks, backyard ducks, and even most of the breeder flocks are reporting 0 clinical signs in those flocks. The incubation period for AI is going to vary a little bit depending on the viral load, so how much virus was introduced into the flock, what was the route of exposure, what species are we talking about, and how good is the bird owner at detecting clinical signs. Birds as a prey species, their natural instinct is to try and hide the fact they're sick for as long as possible. So if owners aren't paying very close attention, they may miss some of those early signs of disease. In individual birds, especially in experimental settings, clinical signs can appear as soon as a few hours up to about 3 days post-infection. On a flock basis, we generally consider the incubation period to be up to 14 days for clinical signs and mortality to reach a noticeable level. So who to contact? As a veterinarian, if you see poultry with clinical signs that are compatible with HPAI, especially if you've got high mortality, certainly you can call the Maine State Veterinarian's office. If there are producers that don't have a relationship with a veterinarian, they are encouraged to call the USDA sick bird hotline, and then they will be directed to the appropriate individuals in their state. As far as diagnostic testing, the recommendation is if you suspect HPAI in a flock, either that you're seeing the birds yourself or an owner calls you concerned about it, if you are at all suspicious of HPAI, do not bring birds to a diagnostic lab. It is much better to send someone out into the field to collect those samples and get the samples to the lab rather than transporting the birds, because transporting the birds is a risk of spreading disease during that process. It's much easier to maintain biosecurity around a single tube of BHI broth than it is dead carcasses. Diagnostic testing primarily relies on PCR. For gallinaceous poultry, it's primarily oropharyngeal or tracheal swabs. For waterfowl, it's cloacal swabs. And I've included this chart just as a reference, but NVSL, the National Veterinary Services Laboratory, as well as the NALN, the National Animal Health Laboratory Network labs, have very, very, very specific requirements for what constitutes an acceptable sample, including the type of swab material, the volume of media, the number of swabs that you can pool in a tube, all of that stuff. So generally the recommendation is if you suspect HPAI, contact your state veterinarian's office or contact USDA, and they can direct sample collection. In a lot of cases, they will actually send out a state or federal veterinarian to collect those samples. Because if you collect the wrong sample and it gets to the lab will not test that sample. We do also still do virus isolation for confirmation, and for USDA does a lot of experimental testing with viruses that we get from high path outbreaks to determine, to do research, determine how similar viruses were to each other and try and figure out how did things spread. The important thing to remember is that serology is not appropriate for high path AI. We use serology, so looking for antibodies in the blood for routine surveillance for low path AI, but with high path AI, most infected gallinaceous birds will die very rapidly before they've had a chance to develop antibodies. So we really do need testing that's looking for the virus itself. So diagnostic testing, so you collect your samples for high path AI from a sick bird or sick flock. We do also do testing, obviously, once there is a detection. We do surveillance in surrounding healthy flocks. Sick bird samples are generally collected by a state or federal veterinarian or a state animal health technician. In the event of an outbreak, most states do have a program for trained or approved certification program for industry personnel to be able to collect those samples. Generally, that's for healthy flocks that are testing as part of a surveillance program. So PCR results for avian influenza, for reasons that have honestly never been clearly explained to me, we can't just use the term positive and negative. We like to make things complicated. So if you do submit samples for AI testing, your results will be reported as either not detected, which basically means negative, or non-negative, which basically means positive. So if you have non-negative PCR results on testing that's performed at your state NALN lab, especially in conjunction with clinical signs that are consistent with high path AI, then that flock is considered a presumptive positive. However, the only laboratory that can actually confirm AI is the National Veterinary Services and Laboratory in Ames, Iowa. So if your state NALM lab has a non-negative PCR result, that sample then gets forwarded to NBSL for confirmation. So as far as the response timeline, so if you start with samples collected from a flock, either because you have sick birds, and if you are collecting samples from sick birds that are consistent with high PathAI, certainly best to quarantine that flock while you're waiting on test results. Or you have samples collected as part of surveillance testing in an outbreak situation. And those samples get sent to the state lab. If it's not detected, great, flock is negative, move on. If you do have sick birds, proceed with other diagnostic testing. If the result is non-negative, that's where our foreign animal disease response really gets initiated. Your state veterinarian will issue a quarantine for the infected premise, which means that there's no movement of birds, equipment, or really anything off of the site. And those samples get forwarded to NBSL for confirmation. At which point, we establish control and surveillance zones, and I'll go over the difference between those two in a minute. The affected flock is then depopulated. All birds on the premise are disposed of, as well as any other infectious materials. So that would include eggs, feed, litter, bedding, all of that stuff has to be disposed of according to federal guidelines. Once disposal is complete, then we move into the virus elimination phase. That's basically our cleaning and disinfection. We'll start with a dry clean, may or may not do a wet clean depending on the facility in certain circumstances. And then you do a disinfection step. So some options there are you can do a heat treatment, which is basically heating the barn to a minimum of 100 degrees for 7 days. Or there are processes for wet disinfection, so using chemical disinfectants or fumigation. Once that cleaning and disinfection is completed, then we collect environmental samples from the environment to verify that there is no longer live virus present in that facility. The facility is then required to have a minimum of a 14-day fallow period or an empty period where those clean and disinfected barns sit empty for a minimum of 14 days. At that point, then the quarantine can be lifted and the premise is allowed to stock with new birds. The exact timeline on this is highly variable. So it kind of depends on how big was the first flock that was infected. A backyard flock with 10 birds is going to be a lot easier to clean up than a commercial layer premise with 1 million birds. And what's the production type? A caged layer facility is much more difficult to deal with than a floor raised broiler flock situation. So that does determine your method of depopulation. Your method of disposal does also play into this. USDA prefers on-site disposal. So burial is an option in some parts of the country. On-site composting is kind of the preferred method, preferably in-house for like commercial broiler meat bird flocks, because you have big open barns, you can set up your compost windrows inside the house. If you've got a caged layer facility, there's nowhere to set up those windrows, so they do actually do outdoor composting. And in some circumstances, if there's no space on a facility to do composting, there are certain circumstances where USDA will approve transport of mortality to an offsite landfill. How long the response takes also does depend on how many commercial and backyard flocks there are within the control and surveillance zones, and then which method is chosen for virus elimination. So we're going to talk about how we respond. And the next two slides, I'm going to focus on poultry. And here I'm going back to that OIE definition of poultry. So if there is a detection in a poultry premise, we draw a control zone. And so that's a 10-kilometer circle around an infected premise. And that control zone includes an infected zone, which is the initial 3 kilometers, and then a buffer zone, which is so basically you have your infected premise at the center, your infected zone is the first 3 kilometers, and then your buffer zone starts at 3 kilometers and goes for another 7 kilometers to make a total of 10 kilometers. So if a control zone is established, all poultry flocks, both backyard and commercial, within that zone are placed under a general order of quarantine, which means there is no movement of birds or products off of that facility or onto any facilities in that area without a permit from the state or from USDA. Generally, we require weekly surveillance testing for all commercial flocks within that zone. There's a few exceptions to that. And then there is surveillance testing for a subset of backyard flocks. USDA requires testing for all commercial flocks, but it does not require it for all backyard flocks. A lot of that comes down to manpower and resources, recognizing that we're not necessarily going to be able to find all of the backyard flocks. So any movement of birds, eggs, feed, or manure within, out of, or into that control zone requires a permit. And so in order to get a permit, so this is the Secure Poultry Supply Plan is something that was developed after the 2015 outbreak. So during the 2015 outbreak, there were no guidelines or regulations or recommendations for states to determine how to safely move birds. And we recognized that both for animal welfare as well as for continuity of business, we needed a way to be able to move uninfected birds that were within a control zone, either to processing or moving chicks from hatcheries out to farms and those kind of things. So the Secure Poultry Supply Plan was formed, and it was a group of researchers at the University of Minnesota working in conjunction with diagnostic lab veterinarians, state and federal veterinarians, as well as industry veterinarians, to develop a system of science-based recommendations for diagnostic testing, as well as biosecurity practices, to basically create an acceptable level of risk, recognizing that, anytime you move birds in the middle of an outbreak, there is a risk, but trying to bring that risk down to an acceptable level while allowing birds to move. So there are different recommendations depending on the type of bird or product that's being moved and where it's being moved to. If you're interested, I've included the website here. And basically there's, for each of these guidance documents that's a few pages long, there's literally hundreds of pages of mathematical modeling and risk assessments that went into developing the recommendation. Note that these are recommendations, so state or federal incident command may impose additional requirements on a case-by-case basis. So then you've got that 10 kilometers, which is your control zone. Then you draw another 10-kilometer circle from 10 kilometers to 20 kilometers. That's a surveillance zone. So this surveillance zone, the difference between the surveillance zone and the control zone is that there's no restrictions on movement of birds or products within the surveillance zone. So we do testing within the surveillance zone, but there's no quarantines or movement restrictions. Now, if you do happen to have multiple outbreaks, multiple infected premises, you can start to get these very lopsided, overlapping control zones, which make life super challenging to try and figure out which zones you're in. To compare that, if you have a detection on a non-poultry premise, there is no control zone. Instead, we establish a surveillance zone that's just a 10-kilometer zone around that infected premise where we do the surveillance testing, but there's no movement restrictions. And the main difference here is that both in the 2015 outbreak as well as the current outbreak, we haven't seen evidence for spread from these backyard flocks leading to outbreaks in commercial poultry. Whereas we've definitely seen if there's an outbreak in a commercial operation, because of the size of the flocks involved, the amount of virus that's being spread, and how much interaction there is between different commercial operations, we have seen spread between commercial operations. So if there's a poultry flock, we do impose movement restrictions. If there's a non-poultry flock, then we just do surveillance testing. So in order to release the control and surveillance zones, there's a series of steps that have to be met. So first, that infected premise has to be depopulated with mortality disposal complete. If you're composting, then those compost piles have to have been capped. If you're doing on-site burial, then everything has to be completely buried and covered. Or if things are being moved off-site for disposal, then everything has to have been moved off-site. The second thing that has to happen is we have to complete initial virus elimination activities, and that refers to things that are outside of a barn. So basically, if you've done composting, then you have to clean and disinfect all of the equipment that was used, anything that's outside the barn. But if there's a physical barn where those birds were housed, you don't necessarily have to have completed virus elimination activities within the barn in order to release the control zone. You also have to have completed the required surveillance testing within the control zone. So typically, that's going to be a minimum of 2 weeks that USDA wants to see at least 2 rounds of surveillance on all commercial, as well as a subset of backyard flocks. And you basically have to go 14 days with no additional detections within that zone. If you've met these requirements, the control zone will be released. However, the quarantine on the infected premise will remain in place until all virus elimination activities are completed within the barn. And then that premise must have that minimum of 14-day fallow period after cleaning and disinfection. In some circumstances, if USDA determines that cleaning and disinfection is not possible, so one example of this might be game bird operation, where birds are raised in outdoor flight pens where you can't really clean and disinfect an outdoor flight pen. Then that fallow period is going to be a lot longer, and it can be up to 150 days before that site would be released from quarantine and allowed to restock. So typical timeline in 2015 has been 2.5 to 3 weeks for some of the backyard flocks to release that control zone. On the commercial premises, the minimum has been 3 to 4 weeks to release the control zone. And there have been some of the large layer complexes that, control zones are still in place 5-6 weeks after the initial detection. And then that quarantine on the infected premise will remain in place typically an additional 2 to 4 weeks after that quarantine, after the control zone is released. So at this point, I'd be happy to answer any questions about the virus and where we stand right now and response. And then after the break, I plan to talk about what can vets and bird owners do to hopefully prevent outbreaks in the future.
Great, thank you, Dr. Leidy. Are there any questions or comments even from the veterinarians who've participated in the HPAI response in Maine?
Hi, Carol and Dr. Leidy, thank you for that. This is Carolyn, monitoring the chat. So we don't have any questions, at least not that I can see, that have been typed into the chat. There is one comment from Dr. Lichtenwallner at the University of Maine Veterinary Diagnostic Lab, sharing some information of interest on our index case, which actually that case came in through her lab. So she reported her suspicion, I think primarily actually based on the epi information she collected from that case and with everything else going on. So that's how that case ended up being routed. But she shared with us that that flock reported sudden death in the bird that was submitted. And on postmortem exam, she noted subtle internal hemorrhage with no obvious clinical signs that might suggest HPAI. So really kind of highlights the importance of asking those questions like you had mentioned, Dr. Leidy, and kind of being aware of what's going on in terms of current trends with disease transmission to keep it on your list. So that was an interesting intro for Maine into this current outbreak. I also see, Carol, there's a hand up. So maybe that individual can unmute and ask their question if they're comfortable to do that. It's Michelle.
Hi, Dr. Leidy. It's Michelle. It's Dr. Walsh, the State Veterinarian, State Public Health Veterinarian in Maine. Dr. Leidy, excellent presentation, such a great overview for our vets of this really confounding disease. It's actually not that confounding, but there have been some differences in the sort of how the disease manifests in the flocks. I think particularly, actually, I think it's true in both the commercial and the backyard flocks. The sort of pattern of morbidity and mortality is slightly different than the 2014-2015 outbreak, most likely due to the difference in the strain that we're looking at. But rather than go down that rabbit hole, and you might be talking a little bit more about that, I'm not sure. I did just want to acknowledge that you are absolutely correct in your research about Maine and the pattern of, well, what infected flocks we had, the number of flocks. It was 12, all backyard flocks, all OAE, non-poultry except one. And our last detection was indeed on April 5th. And of an infected flock in Waldo County. And we therefore, so for the most part, our surveillance areas were open for about 14 days while we did a couple of rounds of contact to all of the known backyard premises and commercial premises. Luckily for us, none of our surveillance areas had any commercial premises within them, but all of our surveillance areas are currently closed. One of the reasons that I had my hand up and that I wanted to unmute now, because it seems like a good time to do this, is that one of the issues we've seen in Maine, while we've had really good, I think we've had a great partnership with a various agencies and our press information officer, our media folks here in the state, in getting the word out to poultry owners about both commercial poultry premises operators, but also just backyard flock owners to report sick birds. People have been doing that. But one of the hiccups we've seen is that I think that some of our private practice veterinarians who do see poultry, and we maintain a poultry vet list at the state, because we get a lot of calls from poultry owners who have never seen a veterinarian before. So it's helpful for us to know who in the state is seeing poultry so that we can send that list out if somebody does inquire of our office, because we're not in the business of veterinary medicine. We're not private practitioners. We don't see birds. We don't see swine. We refer them to private practice veterinarians. So for any of you who are out there and you see poultry and you haven't already interfaced with myself or Dr. Hurwitz or somebody else from the state veterinarian's office to let us know that, if you'd like us to add you to that list, please let me know. You can put your name in the chat and we'll add you. But one of the things I wanted to encourage any practitioner who sees poultry to do is not be afraid to see poultry these days. I think what we ask all clinics who do see poultry to do is to actually practice really good biosecurity in your clinic. So if you have resident birds in your practice that live at the clinic, etc., make sure that they are in an area where, you know, very secure from where the areas that you're doing intake of poultry species and where you're seeing poultry for exams and procedures. So that's number one. The other thing is, if you get an inquiry from a bird owner about an illness in their bird, and in the description to your front desk staff or whoever's screening those calls, there's nothing to suggest that this bird has influenza signs, then please see that bird immediately. Don't defer because we have an outbreak here. And I also think in this period where, while we still believe that there's plenty of virus in the environment, and we haven't really talked a whole lot about that, Dr. Leidy, here today, but you know, the virus is still viable for quite a bit of time, unfortunately, when it's cold and wet in the environment. But we also have migrating birds and likely wild resident dabbling duck and possibly goose populations here that still carry the virus and are potentially shedding. So we do think that the risk is high, but I do think it's safe to see poultry as long as you're practicing good biosecurity in your clinics. So please don't refer them onto the USDA sick bird hotline, which then delays them getting seen by sometimes up to as much as 5 to 7 days. So again, if you're seeing something that looks like a foreign animal disease, and Dr. Lady highlighted those, mottled discoloration of the legs as being very suspicious, please call my office. But otherwise, please see Poultry and Practice Good Clinic Biosecurity. And I'll just be quiet there, Dr. Lady, and you can continue fielding the questions from the audience. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I get a lot of calls as well that I'm fielding of, my bird died, and it's okay, you've had one bird die and you've got 50 birds that are totally fine. It's probably not high path. Or, you've had 3 birds die over the last 6 months. It's probably not high path. As certainly I always encourage those folks to call. I'm happy to talk them through it. But, here, at least here in Pennsylvania, the vast majority of the sick bird calls that we've done have not been high path. They've been something else.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Lady. And I'll tell you, and I'll share this with the veterinarians who are on the call, the criteria that we use is criteria that's recommended by the criteria we use to move you up the suspicion for disease, the high path disease rubric, is that you've had the death of 3 or more gallinaceous birds, that's chickens, turkeys, guineas, peafowl, within a week, and regular contact with wild waterfowl, and or introduction of new birds into your flocks within the past 14 days. So if any of those sort of apply to the case that you're seeing, then I would be a little bit more suspicious about what's happening in that flock. But like Dr. Lady said, for the vast majority of sick birds, especially now with new chicks coming out and being introduced into flocks without any quarantine, etc., it's much more likely to be something like MG or MS or just the routine things that cause respiratory disease in chickens than HPAI. But I do understand why vets are hesitant and they don't want to do the wrong thing. So you can always refer to our office. You call our office and talk to us and we'll talk you through it. Thanks.
I have a question. This is Carol. Is HPAI cause mortality in any other species?
So definitely chickens, turkeys. Turkeys actually seem to die far worse than chickens do. Pheasants, chuckers, peafowl, all of the gallinaceous species. It definitely has caused mortality in some bald eagles, some other raptors, some vultures. There have been wild bird mortality reported in actually both ducks and geese in the US. But what's not clear to me, at least at this point, is whether that was a bird that was found dead that they swabbed that happened to have AI, or and it died for some other reason, or if the influenza actually was responsible for the death of that bird. When USDA publishes their list of wild birds, they'll tell you whether it was a hunter harvest or if it was a wild bird mortality, but they don't release, if there were other like a complete necropsy done. So it's hard to say how many of those ducks and geese were truly considered death due to influenza. Avian influenza virus certainly can be zoonotic. We have had one report in a human in the US with this outbreak. It was a person who was working on a depopulation crew that was depopulating a large commercial flock. That individual several days later developed flu-like symptoms, did a nasal swab for PCR and detected the virus. What's not clear, at least from the information that's been publicly reported, is whether the influenza was truly responsible for that individual's clinical signs, or if it was just a matter of he was working in an environment where there was lots of, high viral load, lots of dust and dander flying, and it was, basically just surface contamination of his nose. That part, I think their additional testing was underway trying to determine. We certainly have in other parts of the world seen human illness and human deaths with some avian influenza viruses. At this point, the CDC does not consider this specific H5N1 to be a significant public health concern, but certainly public health departments and CDC are monitoring all of the responders on outbreaks. You know, everyone who is involved and has come into contact with known positive flocks is being monitored for development of clinical signs. If anyone develops clinical signs, they are being tested. So far, it's just been that one case. As far as other mammals, in this current outbreak in North America, we have seen death of foxes that has been attributed to the avian influenza virus. In other parts of the world, we've seen infections in harbor seals. There have been occasional reports of cats, but I think those had some other extenuating circumstances. So yeah, I mean, it is a zoonotic disease. And we definitely do see transmission of influenza viruses back and forth between people, birds, and swine. And we get all kinds of crazy reassortment viruses that way.
So you've heard of nothing about ruminants, livestock or horses or equine?
Not to my knowledge. I mean, I can't say that, and certainly not in the current outbreak. I can't say for sure that there has never been a report of an avian influenza virus in ruminants or equines. I know swine definitely are considered susceptible, and swine and turkeys, definitely not a good idea to raise both pigs and turkeys because they love to share influenza viruses back and forth between them. But yeah, not to my knowledge for other large animals.
I guess I would like to say one thing before Dr. Letty starts, is that we have a great office manager here, Erica Combs, who I've heard her on the telephone with poultry owners who call in, and she's very patient, very good about getting all the information. So if they don't have a veterinarian, they're in very good hands when they call our office.
All right, so for the second half of the talk, I wanted to focus on what can you as veterinarians, as well as if any of you happen to also be bird owners, or what can your clients as bird owners do to try and minimize the risk or enhance our ability to respond in the event of an outbreak. So the first thing that I strongly encourage all bird owners to do is register their poultry premise. These are voluntary programs. It's not mandatory. We can't force anyone to, but if everyone who owns birds, regardless of the flock size, registers their premise with the state or USDA, in the event of an outbreak, it's that much easier for state and federal officials to identify where other at-risk flocks might be within those control and surveillance zones and respond appropriately. So a couple options. So if you have commercial operations, or even some backyard producers do meet the requirements for registration with the National Poultry Improvement Program. And so the contact information is there on the screen, and I believe the copy of these slides will be made available to you guys all after the conclusion of this. Or they can also obtain a premise ID through Maine's Animal Health Office, either by calling the office directly or registering online. So unfortunately, HPAI is a very serious disease with very serious consequences, and there's no treatment for this disease. So we do really need to focus on prevention. So one of the most common questions that I get asked is, can we vaccinate for avian influenza? And unfortunately, in the United States, no. USDA does not permit vaccination for highly pathogenic avian influenza. And the reasons for this are complicated, but the first one is there's a huge impact on international trade. International trade of poultry and poultry products is dependent on those countries being considered free of highly pathogenic avian influenza. And if we start vaccinating, we lose that status as free. So right now, the US approach is to eradicate the disease whenever it is found. The next challenge with vaccination, even if we were willing to deal with the impacts on trade, is that the current vaccines that are available do not allow for differentiation between vaccination and natural infection. Right now, our entire program in the US is dependent on serology as our means of passive and active surveillance. And so if we start vaccinating, we lose the ability to use serology to determine flock status. So that's a huge thing. There is advancing technology and a lot of research being done on influenza vaccines, and the hope is that someday we may overcome this hurdle. And I think if we overcome that hurdle, that may also change the international trade implications of vaccination. But at least right now, it's not currently an option. And then the next thing is the cost of the vaccine, both the vaccine itself, as well as the cost and the logistics of how do you widely disseminate that vaccine to at-risk flocks. We certainly wouldn't want to use a live virus influenza vaccine, which limits then you to all of the killed and recombinant vaccines are injectable. So you either have to administer them at the hatchery or handle every bird to inoculate, which when you start talking large commercial flocks becomes a major challenge. So the US does maintain a stockpile of avian influenza vaccines. There is ongoing research, and those vaccines are updated as different strains emerge. So the option is there if USDA determines that we've lost control. But as things stand right now, the USDA's approach is eradication. So that story may change in the coming years, but for right now, vaccination is not on the table for us. So what can we do? It all comes down to biosecurity. And the goal is to keep anything that's outside of your flock out, but also to keep anything that's inside your flock in. You want to be a good neighbor and not share anything that you might have in your flock with anyone else. And a lot of people seem to think that these principles really only apply to large commercial operations, and that's really not true. The general principle can be applied to any size operation. And while there is a lot of variation in setup and how small and backyard flocks are housed and raised, the same general principles can be applied. It just needs to be tailored to a specific situation. So one thing that Dr. Walsh mentioned before the break was how long this virus can persist in the environment. And it's a long time. It is temperature dependent. It's also dependent on whether the virus is protected within organic material. A single influenza virus is very easy to kill. It's susceptible to a lot of common disinfectants. The problem is if that influenza virus is protected within organic material, so feces or feathers, or especially egg white, or if it's in a moist or wet environment in cool temperatures, it can survive for days to months. So it is important to remember that yes, warmer temperature and sunlight are very effective at disinfection, but it has to be a clean, dry surface for that to work. So the important thing for biosecurity is to maintain a line of separation of the flock, around the flock. So that could be the walls of a barn or a coop, but even if you have birds that are outdoors, it could just be the fence of a run or a pen or a yard or the pasture. And so you want to consider the potential risks from anything that's crossing over that line. So that can certainly be wild birds, but also other animals, rodents, while not infected with influenza. If they run through wild bird feces, they can then drag that serve as a fomite to drag that into your flock. People, especially our footwear and our clothing, and then tools and equipment can all serve as fomites for transmission of the disease. So even for people who can't contain their birds, if they're free ranging in their backyard, and you can't necessarily completely eliminate potential for contact with wild birds, it's important to remember that that person's yard is only so big. So there's only so many birds that wild birds that flock has the potential to interact with. And so people and equipment are still a big risk because we go out into the environment, we go to Tractor Supply or other farm stores and interact with other people that might have birds, and we don't know what they might be, dragging around on their shoes. So while a bird owner may not be able to completely prevent direct contact with wild birds in their yard, they can still reduce the risk that they're dragging anything else home to their flock. So right now, especially if at all possible, best to keep birds indoors. If you have a coop or fencing or netting, important to maintain that structure so that there's not holes or gaps or cracks that wild birds can get into. If you can't completely enclose your birds in a coop, then you can consider netting and things over a yard or a fence to at least prevent wild birds from landing in your yard. To minimize the risk of contact with wild waterfowl, discourage birds from congregating near your flock. So clean up feed spills. If you knock over a feeder or you spill a bag of feed, don't just leave it there because that's attracting wild animals to your premise. So clean those up immediately and dispose of them properly. Minimize habitats for wild birds. So the ducks and the geese like water. If you have gravel driveways with divots and potholes in them that are forming puddles, bring in some extra loads of gravel and clean that up to discourage those wild birds from wanting to hang out near your yard. One question that I get asked a lot is, what about songbirds? Are those a huge risk? Should we be taking down wild bird feeders? At this point, most of the wildlife biologists say that songbirds are not a huge risk for transmission of avian influenza. And so most are not recommending that the general public take down wild bird feeders, at least from an AI control standpoint. However, I will say if you have a poultry flock, it's probably not a good idea to hang a wild bird feeder right next to your coop. Not so much from the AI standpoint, but from mycoplasma, salmonella, all of the other diseases that songbirds can carry. And certainly don't want to be feeding ducks and geese right now. We want to encourage those birds to continue their migration and get out of here. So, don't encourage those guys to stay around by providing them food. Definitely need to limit your contact with wild birds and their feces so that you're not dragging something back to your flock. So best to avoid places where wild birds congregate. So parks and ponds. This picture was taken by a colleague of mine in Delaware, adjacent to a large commercial poultry operation, and those are snow geese. And so, definitely don't want to go walking through this field and then come home to your own birds. If you do happen to come into contact with wild birds, or you've been out at a park or a pond or walking through a field where you might have come into contact with wild bird feces, always best to shower and change clothes, especially footwear, before returning to your flock, and definitely want to wash and disinfect your vehicle. And not just the tires, but also keep in mind the floorboards of your vehicle. If you walked through wild bird feces and then got into your vehicle without changing your shoes, you might have contaminated the inside of your vehicle as well. Right now, hunting wild birds, I think most, if not all states, should be out of, duck and goose season, but hunting wild birds, especially waterfowl, is definitely a huge risk right now for anyone who owns or works with domestic poultry. Since the hunters always get mad at me when I tell them that they shouldn't do it, if you are going to go hunting, best to wear gloves when handling and dressing carcasses. Make sure you're dressing those carcasses and disposing of the waste at a location away from your flock. So, if you're going out and you're hunting ducks or geese, don't bring them home and dress them right next to your coop. Ideally dress them in the field and dispose of those carcasses and don't drag that back to your house. Wash and vacuum the inside of the vehicle that was used for those activities. And again, make sure you shower and change your clothes, including footwear, before returning to your flock. A lot of our backyard flocks are mixed species flocks. So that includes having gallinaceous birds like chickens and turkeys. And we really need to keep those birds separated from waterfowl. So this is the USDA Defend the Flock picture, and I'm not a fan of this picture because we don't want those guys next to each other. So if you do have a mixed flock, best to keep your gallinaceous birds, so your chickens, your turkeys, your peafowl, your guineas, separated from wild water or from domestic waterfowl as well. So if you can have 2 separate coops or 2 separate pens, that's the best situation. When it comes to AI, these guys are our plague vectors. So we just want to limit their contact with our gallinaceous birds. I do want to note that for disease control for other diseases, this still isn't a great idea. Chickens and turkeys and chickens and peafowl, honestly, really shouldn't be housed together either. But for today's focus, main thing is keep those waterfowl away from the gallinaceous birds. Always a good idea to wash your hands before and after working with poultry, not just for reducing the risk of spreading things to those birds, but also, reducing risk of zoonotic disease transmission of things like Salmonella and E. coli to yourself. I always recommend that people have dedicated clothes or coveralls and footwear or shoe covers that they use only when working with their birds. This is something that is becoming standard practice in the commercial industry, but a lot of backyard flock owners don't think about. So it could be as simple as just having a separate set of clothes that are your clothes that you put on when you're working with your flock. And then you don't wear those same clothes to the grocery store or to the feed store or whatever. If you have an option for cloth or disposable coveralls or rubber boots or disposable shoe covers, certainly a good idea. If you do have an enclosure for your birds, whether that's a coop or a separate pasture or run or whatever, you might want to consider having a waterproof storage container. So something like a Rubbermaid tote, or even these boxes that are designed for package delivery. You can put one of these, next to the entrance to your coop or next to the entrance to the pen where your birds are housed, or you keep, those rubber boots or disposable shoe covers and a pair of coveralls that you pull on as you go into that coop and take off as you come out, so that you're not dragging anything that you might have been exposed to into that pen or bringing anything back into your own home. Again, there we're more concerned about general biosecurity and disease control. But these are simple strategies that almost anybody can do. Foot baths can be a challenge. A lot of backyard flocks I honestly don't recommend bothering with, because if you're not going to keep them clean, it's not worth it. The disinfectant really does have to be refreshed frequently. And the disinfectant really only works if you've got boots that are already clean of visible organic material. So if you've walked through mud and then you step in a boot dip, it's not doing you any good. And then if you're keeping them outdoors, a style with a lid is recommended so that you're not having dust and dirt and things fall into that. And obviously liquid disinfectant is not effective if temperatures are below freezing. There are these dry powder boot dips. Again, I'm not a huge fan of them because they really only get the bottom of your shoe. They don't target like the top of your shoe at all. And if you're walking through grass and whatnot, it's not just the bottom surface of your foot that might come into contact with things, the top of your toe as well. So honestly, for a lot of folks, I'm not sure that these are worth it in a backyard setting, but the options are there. Definitely don't want to be sharing tools or equipment with other bird owners. If at all possible, store any tools or equipment that you use with your flock indoors so that there's not a risk of wild birds roosting on that equipment. And definitely want to clean and disinfect all tools and equipment before bringing it into your barn or coop or pasture. And important to remember that cleaning and disinfection is a multi-step process. Disinfectants are only effective when applied to a clean, dry surface. So you do have to wash away the organic debris before you apply disinfectant. If you're storing feed, it should be in a dry, covered location. You want to prevent access by wild birds, rodents, or other animals. As far as water source, ideally you want to avoid the use of surface water like ponds, for drinking water for your flock or for cleaning purposes. If you have the option, municipal or groundwater sources pose a much lower risk for contamination. Important for biosecurity to limit visitors to your flock, especially right now, should really only be having essential visitors. So those people that are absolutely necessary to help you care for your birds or for essential repairs or maintenance on your coop or your pens. And before you allow anyone to come into contact with your birds, you should ask them questions. Do you have your own birds? Have you been in contact with other birds? And make sure that you're asking those questions so that you know what the risk is. And if they say, I've got a bunch of birds at home, maybe it's not the best idea to have that person helping you with your flock. If possible, keep extra coveralls and boots or shoe covers available for visitors, and keep a record of all visitors so that if there is a disease outbreak, it might help you trace back where it came from, but also so that you can be a good neighbor and let people who were in contact with your flock in the past few days know if you then suddenly have a disease issue so that they can take appropriate precautions with their own birds. And certainly if you do own birds, you don't want to be visiting other people's flocks. Best to limit visits to places like feed stores and farm supply stores to the end of the day if at all possible, so that you're not going from the feed store directly back to your flock, because you have no idea who else has been in the store that day, what other animals they might have, and what diseases they might have. And you certainly don't know if that person followed appropriate biosecurity before going to that place. So really best to shower and change clothes, including footwear, before you return to your own birds. I think we're coming to the end of chick days, but certainly don't handle the chicks and ducklings at the store unless you plan on buying them. Note that very young chicks are considered a very low risk for avian influenza. Birds less than 2 weeks old, if you're seeing high mortality in young chicks, it's probably not AI, but still not a good idea to handle those birds unless you're planning on bringing them home. If you are introducing new birds to an existing flock, it's best to source birds from NPIP participating hatcheries or flocks, because there are requirements for disease surveillance through that program. It's also best to quarantine any new birds away from your existing flock. The USDA recommends a minimum of 30 days. And this applies to new birds that you're bringing into your flock, as well as any birds that you took to a show or a fair. If you're bringing them back home again, best to isolate them from your birds in case they picked something up while they were at the fair. When it comes to biosecurity, we are obviously currently in a period of elevated risk, but there is never a time when there is no risk of disease introduction. So biosecurity is really something that needs to be done year-round. The nice thing about biosecurity is that these practices will help limit the risk of many diseases, not just avian influenza. And I do encourage all poultry owners to have a written biosecurity plan and to register their flock. That written plan really does help in the event of an outbreak situation. If you do have a small flock owner or a backyard flock owner that is trying to move birds in the middle of an outbreak, they are actually required to have a biosecurity plan that's written down in order to get a permit to move birds or product. For you as the veterinarian, definitely important to consider biosecurity when you're visiting clients with backyard poultry. And that applies even if your intended patient is not poultry. So if you're going to a dairy farm or a mixed species farm, and you're there to see the cows, but they also happen to have backyard chickens on that premise, it's important for you to take precautions because some of your other clients may also have backyard chickens. So make sure that you're wearing the appropriate PPE of, rubber or disposable boots and coveralls so that you're not dragging anything home with you. And again, make sure you're disinfecting your vehicle and any tools or equipment. I mentioned this briefly before, but the CDC currently does not feel that there is any immediate public health concern from this H5N1 virus, but they certainly recommend always washing your hands after handling birds. Another common question is this a food safety concern? So no, avian influenza is not a foodborne pathogen. First of all, no eggs or meat from known infected flocks will enter the food supply. But if for some reason something got missed. Basically, if you were early in an incubation period and somehow some bird that was in fact infected but undetected made it into a processing plant, virus is easily killed by normal cooking processes. So as always, CDC recommends following safe meat and egg handling guidelines, and always make sure to cook poultry and eggs to an internal temperature of 165 degrees. Future outlook. Unfortunately, it's a giant question mark. So in the US, we have never seen an outbreak of HPAI in domestic poultry extend through the summer. However, there's a giant asterisk and caveat on that has not necessarily been the case in other parts of the world. So we generally do consider that as the wild bird migration finishes up and birds finish moving north, and we have warmer temperatures and bright sunny days, that should help reduce viral load in the environment. But with this particular virus, we have seen basically reemergence basically every fall and spring in certain parts of Europe over multiple successive years. So even if we do kind of reach an end of this outbreak later this summer, there is a serious concern that we will see this again in the fall as birds migrate south again. You know, some researchers and wildlife biologists are estimating that we may continue to see outbreaks for at least a couple of years related to this virus. If you want additional information, so I've provided links to the USDA website for national outlook. Your Maine Department of Agriculture does have update on local situation. If you want more information on biosecurity, USDA has a lot of resources through their Defend the Flock program. Also included a link to an extension webinar that I did through Penn State a couple of months ago. So the first part of that webinar where I talk about current status, that was done at the beginning of March. So that part doesn't apply anymore, but the biosecurity stuff is still relevant, and that full recording is available online on our website. And then if anybody is really interested in the federal HPAI response, there's literally hundreds of pages of guidance documents available on the USDA website. Or if you are having insomnia and need to bore yourself to sleep, there's lots of fun reading material available on the USDA website. And with that, I'd be happy to take any additional questions.
So you can unmute yourself, or maybe Carolyn can take care of the chat.
Hi, this is Dr. Nate Harvey from New Hampshire. Thanks for the awesome presentation, Dr. Leidy. Just wanted to comment real quick on one of the things you mentioned. I heard you say we're coming to the end of chick days. And I know that traditionally in previous seasons before COVID and before HPAI recently, you know, we typically had a relatively defined period of chick days or chick season being limited to the spring, and people would raise their animals throughout the year and stuff. But certainly the last couple of years, we've seen a serious distortion of the quote unquote chick season. And in the last couple of years, we saw, you know, at least our local poultry dealers and hardware stores and livestock dealers, et cetera, selling chicks and importing chicks and selling them well into the fall. So I don't know if that will continue or not, but I don't know if you guys have seen a similar pattern down in Pennsylvania, but all of our livestock, our traditional spring livestock seasons have extended well beyond normal the last couple of years. Just curious if you've had that too.
Yeah, I mean, we've certainly seen a huge surge in the number of people suddenly trying to raise backyard birds. I admit I actually avoid the stores that sell chicks on purpose because I do work still with a lot of commercial poultry, and in my previous life, I worked directly with commercial operations. So I have historically always tried to avoid stores that I know sell chicks. So I have not actually been in any of the stores this year to know how many birds are still out there. But yeah, you're right. We have seen a huge increase in the number of people raising backyard poultry. And, you know, I don't know how much that has played into the increased detections that we've had in backyard flocks this year, or if it's we're doing a better job on outreach, and so more things are finding their way to a diagnostic lab and getting diagnosed, or if it's because, there is just that much more virus present in the wild bird populations, or maybe it's a combination of all of those.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, we share your concerns for those kind of quote unquote over the counter pick up your chicks quickly and easily and locally kind of facilities, especially when you have higher risk or well, a lot more to lose, larger commercial operations. But being here at the Department of Agriculture in New Hampshire, and I'm sure it's the same in Maine, we have to license those stores, so we do have to go visit them. So yeah, your biosecurity slides are well taken. So thanks very much.
You're welcome. I do see a question in the chat that's, what is the relative risk of exposure to wild waterfowl versus non-waterfowl wild game birds, i.e. grouse or woodcock or wild turkeys? So your non-waterfowl, so your grouse and wild turkeys, as gallinaceous species, those birds are highly susceptible to high PathAI. So generally, if they get infected, they will die. So, I mean, yes, there's a risk, but in terms of sustained disease transmission, we consider the waterfowl a bigger risk because they're asymptomatic carriers. So they're still going about their normal life. They're migrating, they're hanging out in parks and things like that, versus, the wild turkey that's infected is going to keel over within a few days. So it's not likely to spread as far or have as much interaction with other susceptible birds.
This is Carol again. I had a question. In your slides on kind of backyard flock biosecurity, you talk about containing them in yards that have total fence cover or put netting up. I know that the organic production is allowing organic flock owners to keep their animals inside. That's kind of the general rule, you keep them inside. So in Pennsylvania, does having them in a totally enclosed pen outside count as inside protection?
I mean, no. If from a true, absolute minimizing your risk of disease, birds should be in a solid sided barn with a solid roof, with no openings that allow wild birds to get in. There's a reason that the commercial poultry industry went away from range reared and started building houses, and it was because of biosecurity and disease control. I recognize that is not going to be an option for every backyard flock. So the more that you can do to contain them, the better off you're going to be. So if you can put netting up so that, wild birds can't land directly in the same pasture and be in direct contact with them, that's going to be better than not having something. But yeah, if you, netting is not going to stop feces from falling in. So the more that you can do, the better. And I do obviously recognize that that's not always going to be an option.
Thanks, Dr. Lady. This is Carolyn monitoring the chat here, and we've got one additional question from Jim. Jim's question is, are there any approved chemical disinfectants for decontamination of a facility affected by HPAI?
Yes, there are. And it's actually a pretty long list. I don't know if USDA actually does have a publication. And I don't know if I'll be able to find it in my email quickly. But basically, there's a long list. Most common disinfectants, bleach, quaternary ammonia compounds, aldehydes, are going to be effective. When you're looking for a disinfectant, if it says effective against influenza viruses on the back, that's going to be effective. The main things when it comes to disinfection are contact time and dilution So follow the label directions for that. You know, when it comes to disinfection, the challenges with poultry facilities is that we often have untreated plywood, and, you know, things that are considered porous surfaces that, you know, all of our disinfectants say that they should be on non-porous hard surfaces that have been cleaned and dried. A lot of poultry facilities still have dirt floors, which, you know, you can't disinfect dirt. So that's where things become a challenge. That's why the heat treatment option exists, because if you can crank the temperatures up high enough, and you've removed the organic material, then the virus will be killed just from the nature of heat. But let me see if I can find that for you quickly.
Thank you.
I just put in the chat a link to what should be, I think, was I should have clicked on it before I put it in the chat to make sure that that was the link that I thought it was. Oh no, it's a dead link. All right. I will see if I can find it and email it back to Carol and have her send that out. But if there are any other questions?
Anything else in the chat at the moment? And I don't see any hands.
Okay, so I have another question. This is Carol. Not having been part of the HPAI response, when a veterinarian, a clinician goes to visit a farm that might have a case, just to check, should they be wearing N95, like respiration masks?
Yeah, so generally the recommendation is Tyvek suit with hood, or Tyvek suit plus hairnet, gloves. Like for the commercial premises, they'll often actually like duct tape the seam between your gloves and your Tyvek. Definitely, disposable boots, and duct tape that seam again between your pants and the boots. And yeah, N95 respirators are recommended for high PathAI response. And disposable is recommended so that you can leave that trash behind, and not actually bring that with you. Leave it at the facility to be disposed of there. In case it is in fact high PathAI, it can then be disposed of along with everything else that needs to be disposed of.
All right, it's 1:39 in the afternoon, and so it looks like she found a list of antimicrobial products for avian influenza. And that's the US EPA, yes?
Yep, that's the EPA list. USDA also has a similar one, but those are ones that have a specific label claim for avian influenza.
Right. All right. I don't know if you have any parting words of maybe what's happening in Pennsylvania, or
yeah, unfortunately, Pennsylvania, for us, it has been all commercial premises. And we have had several large layer facilities that are definitely more of a challenge. So we are still multiple active control zones right now, and just hoping for no additional detections, I think, like most of the country is right now.
Right. Okay, so that just shows how it's continuing and how important it is. And we really thank you for all this useful information. And this is recorded so people can refer back, and also the recording that Dr. Lighty cited that she did in March as long, in depth and really good for the poultry owners as well. And they had a lot of questions at the end, so really good to clarify stuff. All right, well, if that is all, thanks everyone for attending. And this recording will be put up probably in a week or two, and as well as the PDF of the presentation. So thanks everyone for attending, and thank you very much, Dr. Lighty.